I would like to start us off with an apology. I've absolutely fallen in love with this adorable little town of Visby, but unfortunately it seems like one of your adorable little viruses has fallen in love with me, and I can't hit the high notes right now. But I'm gonna try, goddammit. I'm gonna put in the effort to give a speech, even though I have lost my voice. So with that being said, hello. Oh, there it goes. My name is George Weidman, and I am here to talk about movies and games, and specifically how movies are not games, and how there's this commonplace allure that you often see between the two of them. It's impossible to ignore their influences with one another, but what's far more common is overstating what sounds to me like a kind of inferiority complex, as if cinema is and should be a higher frame of reference for artistic achievement than video games. And this aspiration to be cinematic is everywhere. When I ordered a PlayStation 4, it was the first thing I saw when I cut open the box. It is on the headlines of game reviews. It pans across explosions on TV commercials. And what's really surprised me is that this is also what prodded the idea for this talk, is that it's even in ostensibly countercultural places like here at GGC. The reason I say countercultural is, well, you have these themes. Last year's theme referenced mainstream gaming as the same franchise crap. This year's said that we're going to look over a sea of lowbrow, mass-market AAA titles and bandwagon jumping time waster mobiles, before it goes on to make a lot of the same assumptions that the industry it's criticizing does. Sorry about that. So this seems fishy to me for a few reasons. One is because hindsight is 20/20, and it's often hard to fairly judge things that become masterpieces over the course of time. Another is that games have existed for centuries before movies, and I've always just kind of interpreted video games as simply being games on a video screen rather than movies on a video game screen. So, anyways, the theme goes on to say that we'll be looking at games that have tried to say something, that will look at how games can have a myriad of serious, social, and introspective voices. So let's do that. Let's find out where a game's voice is, and what in the world it has to do with cinema. Because right now, in 2015, this is actually a really interesting time to be having this kind of discussion because of YouTube. Like I said earlier, my name is George Weidman, and I come from YouTube. I run a channel called Super Bunny Hop that you guys should subscribe to and tell your friends about. And you should also click on the ads around the video. That's pretty cool too. You should do all that stuff because people like it. I guess they invited me over here, which is really flattering, and I still haven't really gotten over it. I wonder if the state of my mental stress has something to do with the horrible immune system I had here. But anyways. What I produce is news, reviews, and editorial content that skirts the line with academia, much like this presentation I'm giving right now. But for the actual video content, what I do is use the power of recording software to transmute video games into something else, which most other YouTubers take to a very, very literal extreme and make entire video playthroughs of entire video games. Which is interesting because it's presumably turning games into a format that would be much more closer to cinema. What's also interesting is that the games already built from the ground up to be more cinematic don't necessarily adapt to this format as easily as other much more highly interactive games do. The games that get popular on YouTube are built to produce highly interactive, personalized spectacles of comedy, where they create hilarious visual output and situations without stealing the show from the presenter. And this is actually the industry-wide norm. Despite AAA's trends towards more cinematic visuals, games like The Order 1886 and Beyond Two Souls have been critically panned. It's actually video game adaptations of sports and Legos, that's Minecraft right there, not movies that reliably wrestle with the Call of Duties and the Grand Theft Autos for the top sales spots of consoles. And even within those two franchises, it can be argued that the competitive multiplayer of COD and the comedic physics and AI of GTA may actually be selling those games better than the highly scripted, cinematic single-player campaigns that, in the end of the day, just kind of feel tacked onto these products. Meanwhile, on PC, League of Legends, World of Warcraft, and Counter-Strike are among the most regularly played games, which feature no cutscenes during gameplay, very little narrative linearity, and a crisp, clean visual image that is heavily obstructed by all sorts of non-diegetic UI elements, all of which don't fit the conventional definition of a cinematic game. So it would seem that the most popular games don't tap into the appeal of cinema, but rather sports, contests, and toys. And maybe it shouldn't be shameful to be aspiring towards those classical experiences, because it seems that whenever big-budget game developers aspire to be a spectacular Hollywood masterpiece, they end up making something closer to a schlocky grindhouse flick instead. When they aim to create a cinematic experience, that word itself has steadily become a joke on online forums as it is increasingly used to rationalize graphical compromises and non-reactive gameplay. Anyways, what's always fascinated me though, and this is something I don't really fully understand, is the popularity of Let's Plays on YouTube, where people supposedly take the feature that's so unique and sacred to games, which is their interactivity, and strip it away into something more passive, essentially turning games into bad movies. But after reading up on this topic and researching into it a bit, I found that the common consensus among film studies is that movies actually are interactive to a huge extent. Cinema involves a lot of cognitive processes for the viewer to fully interpret and follow a story. You have to concentrate on the picture to fully digest it. You can interact with movies physically as well by laughing, crying, shocking, jolting, startling, adrenaline rushing, and even arousal, which is always fun. So, we might be getting a lot of flack from movie critics for alleged shortcomings in the realm of narrative, but I think it's important that we don't allege that movies have any shortcomings in the realm of interactivity, Exhibit A. Because movies are not necessarily passive experiences, they're still interactive like games. Games are just a hell of a lot more demanding. They require work, long, sustained periods of work where players apply learned skills and get reviewed for it. On the other hand, you cannot fail a movie because you failed to properly interpret it correctly. It's not going to stop playing and just turn off because you didn't notice the foreshadowing in Act 1. Sorry about that. So the aim of this presentation is to explore the tools that both mediums share and then focus on what games can do specifically to grow away from these comparisons to movies. Because what happens when that comparison always comes up is that games get a non-gaming agenda imposed on them to make them somehow more responsible by shifting the events of gameplay into a much, much different context than what's fairly appropriate for a fair games critique. And so what is that context they get shifted into? Frankly, it is cinematics' frame of reference looking towards games from the outside in and vice versa, which very quickly became how business was done after the transition from abstracted 2D visuals to realistic 3D scenes. Within about a 4-year span in the mid-90s, we went from images that looked like a bunch of symbolic representational maps to ones that had foregrounds, backgrounds, framings, camera angles. They ended up creating an image that by and large resembles all the other entertainment that ends up making it onto a television screen. And during that transition from the mid to late 90s, you had this rush for gaming to be more like movies you could control, complete with recognizable big-name Hollywood actors who would perform for these really blurry and kind of awfully acted cutscenes you couldn't control. Cutscenes still might as well be considered little movies directly pasted inside games, to the point where the word cutscene has always been interchangeable with cinematic scenes. Developers were already recognizing the juxtaposition between these two mediums with the choice of that terminology. Because if games were like movies, then they wouldn't have to clarify that those scenes in particular are cinematic. But when you're navigating a 3D world in third person, you're still tethered to the same kind of director of photography that any movie or TV show was going to get. And it's not a person, but an automated algorithm working behind the scenes, except here in Mario, they actually decided to personify it as Lakitu up there, which is kind of adorable and also really, really, really radical by modern standards, is attaching an actual living creature to the mysterious floating non-diegetic camera in the air. So anyways, a lot of early 3D games addressed their newfound need for cinematography in ways that I feel are more diverse and interesting than they do now. Because of the navigational focus of a 3D platformer, backgrounds are more easily going to be the focal point of the player's viewpoint than the foregrounds. The camera almost never cuts from one angle to the next as they do in movies. Instead, you have a slow pan to keep the player's spatial frame of reference grounded every single second throughout the entire game. Compare that to the virtual cameraman we get in Resident Evil, who uses narrow angles and quick cuts to hide enemies off screen and foreshadow future encounters and tantalize the player's curiosity with objects that may or may not be hidden just out of their very, very deliberately chosen frame. Compare that again to fighting games, where the camera is precisely locked to a full view of both figures at all times, retaining both of their positions on the screen no matter where they go or how the background changes, ensuring that the player's view of their character is never blocked by clutter. A highly competitive game requires precision, so the camera here is going to prioritize pragmatism, which is what most other action genres have kind of converged onto. It seems like nowadays everything is either first person or zooming in and out of your character's shoulder because, frankly, that's what gives the clearest picture. Pragmatism ended up winning over the decade over aestheticism. But anyways, either way, a video game's shot is not going to be composted the same way that movies do it at all, but your camera can still accomplish many of their same tricks. Sorry about that once again. An angle below the focal point of the shot emphasizes power, size, and awe. In Shadow of the Colossus, the camera automatically and slowly lowers below the horizon line while aiming slightly upwards and panning away from our character to give more screen space to the scenery. You can see how once its movement is complete, the focal point isn't really our character at all. Instead, it is whatever is far, far off in the distance. A character is simply framing that from the right third of the frame. Low angles can also emphasize speed, since that ground texture is going to be scrolling through the player's viewpoint much, much faster than if the camera was much higher and the focal point was on a more flatter angle with that texture. You can make a racing game feel a lot faster by keeping the camera low without actually having to go to the trouble of increasing the speed of the gameplay. And you can also get the player involved in this process by making them do the camera work themselves. The bosses in Dark Souls, for example, feel so intimidating and powerful for a lot of reasons. One of them is because you end up engaging in that photography direction yourself. A lot of them are so big that you simply can't really get a good idea of their telegraphed attack animations without manually pulling the camera up yourself, sacrificing the view of your own footing for the view of their animations, and thus taking part in cinematography without even really knowing you're doing it. On the other hand, distant, high camera angles emphasize places over faces. As well as giving the player a more generous view, the lives of characters seem more inconsequential and controllable when we're seeing them from high above, from the godlike perspective of a god game. You can easily turn conventional action mechanics into a lighthearted comedy if that's the tone you're aiming for, by zooming the camera out to keep the gritty, gory details of the violence more distant and abstract. But one thing that games get away with that movies rarely try to rely on is the POV shot. And just examining the different ways between how they're used in both mediums, between how this particular trick is used in both mediums, can remind us why these mediums are so different after all. A first-person POV shot is almost used exclusively in movies to explore the subjective emotional state of characters rather than a more dispassionate effect to actually emulate real human vision. We're seeing a first-person perspective here to get inside a character's head rather than their actual eyes, as seen when portraying a character's fear of heights, or a supernatural vision they might be having under extreme circumstances, or to narrow a villain's focus onto a particular victim, once again shot from a high and distant vantage point to emphasize the victim's vulnerability. From the other side of the lens, we can feel our character's own vulnerability from their own perspective, again looking up towards captors. But these are still tricks used in a matter of seconds, while movies can go on and on for hours. It's very rare that a mainstream, fairly well-budgeted, fairly well-recognized cast of actors in non-experimental traditional movie will go first person the whole way. There have been a lot of avant-garde art house stuff over the years, but there's one noticeable exception to that trend that is found far back in history. So I'm going to quickly tab out of here and show you guys a trailer that I hope you find just as interesting as I did.
My name is Marlowe, Philip Marlowe. Occupation, private detective. You know, somebody says, follow that guy. So I follow him. Somebody says, find that female. So I find her. But some cases, like this one, kind of creep up on you on their hands and knees. And the first thing you know, you're in it up to your neck. Right now, you're reading in your newspapers and hearing over your radios about a murder. They call it The Case of the Lady in the Lake. It's a good title. It fits. What you've read and what you've heard is one thing. The real thing is something else. There's only one guy who knows that. I know it. This Lady in the Lake business started just 3 days before Christmas.
Who invited you?
I did.
Now, wait a minute, Mr. Marlowe.
Just when I was beginning to like you.
Well, you want the facts, don't you?
When it concerns a woman, does anybody ever really want the facts? Vain female, aren't you?
Please don't be so difficult to get along with. I need help.
What's going on here?
He got cute.
Striking an officer, resisting arrest, and murder, all on Christmas Eve. Let's wrap you up real pretty, shall we? And take you right down to headquarters. Give me your hands.
You'll see it just as I saw it. You'll meet the people, you'll find the clues, and maybe you'll solve it quick, and maybe you won't. You think you will, eh? Okay? You're smart. But let me give you a tip. You've got to watch them. You've got to watch them all the time. Because things happen when you least expect them.
No, don't! I love you, remember! Drexel. 33391.
There you go. That's from 1947, and it looks like a video game. Critics at the time thought this was charming, but they also thought it was a gimmick. Nowadays, with about 7 decades of retrospect to work with, we can see that it was playing with ideas 50 years ahead of its time. And maybe one of the constant problems of trying to compare games to cinema is that it's the classic movies that were commercially successful that get remembered the most, not necessarily the more relevant commercial failures. Lady in the Lake can tell us a whole lot more about video games than Battleship Potemkin can, because this essentially was a first-person participatory interactive puzzle. It was a video game genre piece way out of its time and place. But the reason why this movie isn't well remembered, and what you can see when reading older reviews of it, is that viewers felt disconnected from its story. The transition between actors who would just stand, shot from the waist high up, flatly delivering lines, would jar when suddenly a punch or a door or a kiss would shove itself in the camera to remind you that this had to be a different kind of film noir detective story. And ever since then, similar first-person shots have been used sparingly in film, but as it turns out, when viewers can't see the main character, the plot feels detached from the main character. And now, with the successes of many more first-person detective games, from Myst to the Frogwares Sherlock Holmes series to Gone Home, we can see that the critical aspect that Lady in the Lake might have needed to succeed was apparently the viewer having control over that first-person camera. But of course, movies couldn't do that in 1946, and they can't really do that today either, because then they'd just be a video game. The artificiality and abstraction of video game space allows for camera tricks that are absolutely impossible in cinema. Another very inventive trick that we've probably grown very used to by now is the smooth pan from first to third person, which until the advent of CGI would require you to somehow phase the character through your actors' skulls, and you probably don't want to do that. Meanwhile, puzzle and strategy games tend to be visually abstract enough to ditch the established norms of cinematography altogether. Some of the most classic video game franchises ever don't look at all like movies and never will, because, after all, games are not movies. Games tell stories in much different ways than movies. The nonverbal representation of ideas they use has a lot more to do with the placement of design elements and the interactive nature of their systems than the composition of a shot or the nuance of a performance. And there's a fundamental difference between these two mediums there. Movies tell stories that have been recorded, written, and happened, but games tell stories that are happening. In other words, games are strictly about action, the action they have with the players. Unlike movies that can exist as a physical object in a room without anyone watching them, the tangible work of a game itself is the material action it has with the players. It won't run without them. In many ways, it might as well not exist without them. Sorry. Video game playing is the dance between two types of actions, defined by Alexander Galloway as machine acts and operator acts. Machine acts being the stuff the software does, and operator acts being the stuff the player does. And the dance between these two actions forms a text. And that text is a certain kind of narrative that is unlike the stories told in any other medium, because what other storytelling medium has machine acts, right? Anyways, it's within the reaction between these two types of actions that one can begin to see just how vast and potentially limitless the creative applications for video games really are. I hope I'm not losing it here. Video games can render social realities into usable form. They can immerse the player in real-world systems and situations in ways that other mediums can't, by transporting them into a place where the limits of time and space are limitless and audience engagement is necessary and guaranteed. In other words, they don't tell stories. They simulate them. There we go. So unfortunately, the challenge for the video game industry is figuring out how to simulate a compelling story on time within budget, while also being tethered to these incredibly complicated 3D rendering engines that may be more difficult to research than rocket science. But there's also a challenge in just figuring out how to properly represent the narrative of that dance. It's the designer's work to figure out how to use symbols that make thematic sense out of that exchange between operator and machine acts. The taxis in GTA and the horse carriages in Skyrim perform an abstract machine act of instantly teleporting the player to a new location, but they're presented with a symbol that taps into the player's own operator act of romanticizing their exploration, of immersing themselves into this world that those taxis and those horses build. It's something that kind of gets broken, in Skyrim at least, when you open up the menu and start fast traveling by clicking on a magically appearing non-diegetic map that just might as well be floating in the sky. Compromises must be made, and unfortunately, it is someone's job to figure out when, where, and why they have to be made. Rod Humble's game, The Marriage, compromises by looking like nothing really in particular. But it's a comparatively ambitious and personal attempt to use mechanics to convey how his marriage felt to him, to simulate the story of developing an oftentimes troubled relationship. Here is what Richard Rouse thinks of game stories. He thinks that a game's own story, with whatever cutscenes, text scrolls, and speech bubbles that might be contextualizing it is less important than the player's own story. So ask yourself, what do the players discover on their own when they play your game? What do they learn about it? What did they learn about their own expectations going into it? And what kind of story does their experience tell? Play conform narratives absolutely easily. Look at games like Minecraft and Crusader Kings 2. These are pretty much blank-slated story-simulating engines for players to create a compelling rise and demise of the characters of their own creation with the systems these games provide. Or look at Papers, Please, which uses these dramatically labeled game tokens like wife and son to spin a tale of economic desperation as the player is never fairly paid enough to fully support this family of gray dots. Although this game's systems are rigged to nudge a story into the player's experience, the experience is still fully the player's. And here's a third point of view that sounds a lot like the previous two. Thomas Grip says that narrative is what happens when you play the game over a long period. It's the totality of the experiences, the player's subjective journey through the game, even including abstract, non-story elements like settings and graphics. So think about what sort of thoughts even those elements are going to elicit from your players. What mental stories will they conjure up between even the most basic gameplay actions? One of hundreds of very basic moves can feel significant if it's framed to be important. And then, hundreds of basic moves later, what story will they conjure up hours afterwards when they've completed the game? The takeaway from all three of these different perspectives, plus my own weird framing of this being about some people's desperation to compare games to cinema, is that while movies may be stories about characters and sometimes the audience, games are stories about the audience and sometimes the characters. To bring this even further back from a long time ago when I was talking about Let's Plays, that would explain the appeal of these Let's Plays. They are stories about a presenter, sometimes the game, sometimes the audience, and very rarely sometimes the characters. So I wanted to run over a few new ideas we can take away from all that, and among them are ways games can provide social, economic, and rhetorical obstacles for the audience to interact with in ways that movies can only really allude to. Games can simulate systems that provide first-hand experience with the push-pull nature of social relationships and how that can be affected by societal systems outside of the player's control. Maybe this is why BioWare's rollicking, high-budget, action-packed sci-fi and fantasy adventures still take some quiet time every now and then to have the player talk to people and make friends and enemies. And even then outside of BioWare, when games made by studios like Obsidian and Larian, managing social relationships with companions has absolutely become a standard issue feature for sword and sorcery fantasy RPGs, which often run these relationships through a system of checks that account for race and gender to create specifically written new scenarios. And what may be a little stranger at the moment is that these social interactions are also the cornerstone of an emerging Western market of visual novels and dating sims that give up on action and violence altogether to fully systemize relationships instead. Games can provide economic obstacles for players too. Real-life decisions have consequences. Many times those consequences are weighed in value. And games are a fantastic way to explore the intersectional effects of economic transactions and how smaller economic problems can snowball into bigger ones. The grand strategy genre is a collection of scattershot economic management games that require the player to juggle limited resources and their value in order to experience how economic forces can have global and historical consequences. This War of Mine, on the other hand, zooms in the scope much closer to create a traditionalistic stealth action game that actually does more to depict the economic horrors of war rather than its straight-up violence. Games can also provide rhetorical obstacles through their malleable actions. They can win arguments by convincing people through direct exposure with a manipulated system. A point can be made by the author by literally gaming the system. Factions at play can be rigged against one another or towards the player to create propagandistic drama. Difficulty can roller coaster up and down at dramatic moments to simulate a sob story, oftentimes to make a point about the evils of whatever dominant system is in question there. In the case of America's Army, we have a very overt attempt at video game propaganda with a rhetorical mechanic that has absolutely morbid implications. So no matter which side of this multiplayer firefight the player is on, they're always going to find themselves on the side that America's Army would like to depict as the good guys, and the opposing side will always look like the bad guys. No matter which team the player happens to find themselves on, the player models will warp to fit the propagandist's ideal image of its propaganda. So let's compare all that to GGC's list from the beginning of the presentation. Battleship Potemkin was widely remembered for its pioneering use of montage to create propagandistic overtones. Papers, Please is widely praised for its pioneering use of game tokens to create propagandistic overtones. Steamboat Willie was an example. That was the first movie to synchronize animation with sound. We also have Mario 64 and Quake, which both very nearly came close to future-proofing two very different kinds of 3D polygonal control and camera schemes during what was almost their first time trying this stuff. Snow White was the first feature-length, fully animated film. The Game Boy was the first fully featured portable console. Then the list goes on, and these comparisons are arbitrary and ridiculous, and that's the point. They make no sense. The constant, never-ending comparison to cinema is, I guess, mildly interesting at best, but it's unproductive most of the time and counterproductive at its worst. Games and cinema can certainly learn a lot from each other, but going much further in either direction ends up creating products that don't seem to satisfy fans of either one. Gaming has already been full of artistic and technical innovations that should in no way be valued less than cinemas, as the two forms are more different than they are alike. They also really wouldn't exist without each other in the first place. Trying to figure out if storytelling came before gameplay would be an endless chicken and egg chase. And trying to figure out if games are just as artistically worthy as movies or not would lead into an endless apples versus oranges debate, because games are not movies. Thank you. So now I'm afraid that I should probably open myself up to questions. Anyone? No? Oh,
Hi.
yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Very interesting talk. I agree with you that games are not cinema. But I'm wondering, where does things like Twitch fit into all of this? Things like Twitch plays Pokemon. That is not one person's narrative through the gameplay. That is a clusterfuck of millions of people, or thousands of people making the narrative together. And how does that fit into everything you presented here?
I guess, I don't know. I mean, my gut reaction would be to frame it into the thing I already did about reframing YouTube Let's Plays as being a story about the personality of the presenter over that of the game. But in the case of Twitch Plays Pokemon, you kind of have a weird collective online social puzzle-solving experience that I would argue has kind of sort of happened before. If you look at the kind of really deep meta puzzles in games like Fez, PT might also be another example. You had people across wide spectrums of the internet coming together to try and solve something together. The case of Twitch Plays Pokemon is like a brilliant example of comedy, because they're just fumbling all over themselves trying to do something that a lot of us didn't find that super difficult as kids. But I'm really glad that you brought that point up, actually, because that so very neatly skirts the line between neither of these, really. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, great talk. I was wondering, while I completely agree with you that, cinema to games, apples to oranges comparison, one of the virtues I've always felt of that kind of argument was that it did kind kind of challenge the level of discourse in games. Like it is an interactive medium, and while it can be a lot of different things, there was kind of I think the problem someone like Ebert or whatever had with video games is that it wasn't art with a big A. If you will.
And I don't really know, frankly, what he was talking about.
Well,
Because,
I guess, let me just finish my question. I guess what I'm saying is that I agree with your overall point, and I guess if we were to just settle the argument there, it's like, oh, okay, we're done. Like, no reason to feel inadequate as game developers about our medium. What do you see as the thing that would push the medium forward and encourage experimentation and not just building on existing mechanics, but actually doing something interesting and a little bit more profound with the medium? You had some examples of games that I think are heading in that direction.
Papers, Please was a really amazing moment for me in 2013 because that's what I felt to me personally as a great narrative step forward, because what I would like to see are more of these very, very extremely player-driven stories that do get gently prodded by the developer to convey a heartfelt emotional message, but without taking the player's control out during the whole experience. I think that's where a lot of great examples of video game storytelling are going to lie in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello.
Hey, great talk.
Thanks.
I'm interested in, I guess there's a relationship that I see between drawing inspiration from other media like film or theater or what have you, and falling into kind of comparing yourself to that medium. And I wonder, like, what do you see as a kind of good relationship between games and other media that they can draw from without being maybe slavish?
I don't really understand why there has to be a conflict in the first place. I think a lot of it stems from marketers trying to capitalize on the historical successes of films rather than the historical successes of games. But I don't know. I mean, I was talking earlier about how games can always learn from movies, and I would have really been interested if people were talking more about that comparison with Lady in the Lake, which I only found in this really dense book by Galloway. But I don't know, on another level, I just think that the sky's the limits, because games can, I don't know, almost accomplish a lot more than what's a good word? Than entertainment that is kept in a solid state and not actionable. Yeah, I mean, experiment, find out what works and what doesn't, and move on from there.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hello.
I guess I can just preface this by saying I'm a graduate student from film science, and I wrote my bachelor's on the cinematization of games. I think some of the angle from the institution and these comparisons that are made, at least on my part, absolutely comes from this frustration that movies are considered high art, as some of the previous questions have mentioned, and games aren't. But movies also, in their early days, did face a lot of the same problems that games are facing, socially speaking, where it's seen as, a dangerous, corrupting influence, it's going to make kids violent, or this or that kind of a thing, which is a discussion. But I think the concerns and the sort of negative outlook on film that did happen early in films. People will confuse it with reality and this stuff, is similar to games as a new medium. So I think some of the comparisons don't come out of a place like, oh, these two are equatable and these two mediums are the same thing, but rather sort of like, can we also treat games as high art, and can we have those discussions but simultaneously view them as something more than children's playthings?
Right. I think in order to really, I guess, either defend or offend games over whether or not they're high art, you kind of have to understand what high art is in the first place. And that's, as someone who's not an expert on these definitions, it's a concept that absolutely baffles me, because as Ian Bogost likes to talk about, art really has not much of a solid definition in modern society at all. So what exactly is the qualifier, the line, the definition of high art now anyways? Do you know?
No, but absolutely, I think that it's, I don't think there is any genuine real definition. I think it's just this sort of association that society gets. And there are trashy films, there's thousands of them produced, it happens all the time, but still as a society we do view films as, a peer. And I think that the academic community surrounding it and the sort of class difference, age difference, it tends to be, it's all, it's all these things. So I don't think that there is like a genuine definition. This is art, this isn't. But
and I bet it has a lot to do with class and age and marketing and finances. Frankly, one of the things I enjoy about games is how they aren't traditionally kind of held to the very bourgeois limitations of quote-unquote high art. I feel there's a lot less room for experimentation when the thing you are working with has a much more narrower definition that no one even knows what the definition is of anyway.
I agree. Another thing, I agree with you that there's a lot of dangers with this games and film comparison. Something that I am very concerned about is the game industry absorbing a lot of these, I would call them bad habits, from the film industry that's been happening sort of the past 20 years as games have, just exploded with their how profitable they are. And you get, the consolidation of developers. You get the, everything has to be a multi-million-dollar franchise. Otherwise, we're not interested in it. If you look at, Hollywood and big productions, you see so many similarities. Cinematic trailers, as you mentioned, when CGI started becoming a thing, every game now has all these cinematic trailers, as often little to absolutely no relevance on the actual game itself. But people see it and go, oh my god, that's going to be awesome. And there's sort of a lot of, there's a lot of problems in that sense with this sort of convergence of advertising, marketing, production strategies, I think.
Right, and again, I have to suspect that marketing and age has a lot to do with it, because as the kind of dominant mainstream form of entertainment, not just the dominant mainstream form of high art, quote unquote, for the past like 50 or so years, cinema has much more of an influential foothold over games than games does over it. But nowadays, it would be absolutely impossible to find countless movie reviewers complaining about how movies nowadays look more like video games to their distaste. And meanwhile, on the other side of the boat, we have many people like myself complaining about how many big-budget AAA blockbuster action games are like movies. And the silver lining of big-budget AAA action games being so financially demanding that they are unstable is that when when people get laid off or lose their jobs as the result of an unsustainable games economy, we end up having a little explosion of indies coming up to make games that, frankly, people who like games tend to like better.
And yeah,
That's the silver lining to a lot of what I think has been happening the past year. The closure of THQ, the popularity of Kickstarter. I'm really interested to see if the rumored incoming consolidation of Konami's gaming divisions might also kickstart a boost in Japanese indie game development as well, because I absolutely love Japanese indie games. I find an incredible amount of polish and passion put into a lot of things that end up on the shmup scene, and having projects like that. We already have one by Igarashi, the Bloodstained Kickstarter, that has come out of that, because Konami wasn't making that before until they shafted this guy for like 3 years.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
Love your talk.
Why, thank you.
So, my question is, visual novels is a great popular in Japan, and a lot of dating novels, a lot of visual novels take on a dating aspect, where you have to make a choice and get a girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever you want. But there's a lot of the visual novels in Japan which offers no choice to the players or very low choice. So you can see that as a medium taken from books, covered into video games, but only with a few aspects of video games. And I feel like it feels like there's some sort of this component base where you can take a video game and have some video game, have some movies, and maybe some text, and you have this spread where you decided that the story is going into the movie part of the game, where the gameplay is going into the game part of the game. And so I think what my question boils down to is, do you think that getting stage fright.
No problem.
When looking at what movies can do, or film can do, in the instructional film, and how books have instructional books, do you think that implementing sort of that, and then moving the instructional part to spread it out, would be a... I'm sorry, kind of lost my thought.
No problem.
There.
I just am now thinking that throwing that thing about the visual novels and the dating sims would be kind of a problematic example to use, right? Because a lot of them don't necessarily hunker down on the interactivity. When I was looking through examples for this project, I found one in particular called there we go, Kitty Powers' Matchmaker. You have a kind of sort of mobile to PC game conversion going on here, where this fabulous drag queen, Kitty Powers, sets people up for dates, and you actually do counterbalance statistical personality traits of these people against one another, and actually try to get them together and manage a successful relationship as a win state, which I think I would be way more interested in that than most of these others that click through text, have the player clicking through a bunch of text, but even then they still have some incredibly branching narratives every now and then that I don't think would be as easily possible in books and movies.
Okay, I think I know now what my question boils down to. If you can look at video games like this component-based, here you have movies, which are cutscenes, and here you have gameplay, which are game. Do you think we'll be able to fuse them in the future, or should there be some disparity of keeping them as separate layers?
Well, I mean, I don't. In no ways do I have the power to dictate any of that, but I just think with the way critical preferences are trending over the past 5 years, player-driven stories like Papers, Please, Crusader Kings 2 for another example. Cart Life, I remember that just like wiping the floors at GDC in 2013, and that was very, very unsurprising. And those games do have a little bit of some cutscenes to them, but not necessarily as dominant as many others that critics don't seem to like as much. It seems like the critical, not necessarily commercial desire for Metal Gear Solid kind of experience seems to be outweighed by more of a desire for a Papers, Please kind of experience.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi again.
Hello.
First thing, like you talk a lot about like games having that's true that games have the unique aspect of interactivity, and that creates narratives and etc. That brings it apart from other mediums. But then there's a little game called Progress Quest, if you know of it. Is that a game? Because you create your own character and then you just let it run. And you can read it and you can laugh at it because it's silly, but at the end of the day, it's still your game, it's still your narrative, even though you have absolutely no agency over it. That wasn't really my question, but I just thought.
So where would that lie in the spectrum? What is the operator act in a situation like that? You say you create a character?
You create a character, and that's pretty much it. Do you know of the game?
Well, what are your inputs for creating this character?
No, you create. Well, if I remember correctly, you choose a race and a class and a name, and then basically it just creates random. Goes on, there's just scrolling text that says the quest that you go to, you pick up loot, you go back to town, you sell the loot, you buy new equipment, and etc. So I think it's like Progress Quest is kind of the ultimate meta commentary on the games as not cinema. In that they created an incredible narrative without any agency, but it's also full agent because you can choose when to exit the game, kill it, everything. I don't know, I'm just rambling right now.
Well, I mean, was it an incredible narrative? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I hate to sound capitalistic here, but was it a commercially successful product?
Oh, it's free, so
yeah,
absolutely.
And there's room for experimentation there, though. So I don't know. In that case, anything goes.
Yeah, my actual question.
Okay.
Sorry, just a random aside there. Genres, gaming genres, movie genres, everything have always been extremely arbitrary, but they have also been extremely core to advertisement and marketing. Do you think that a medium like the games or movies are held back by the absolutely arbitrary rules of creating genres? Like, what actually is a roguelike? It's the most arbitrary genre name I've ever heard, because none of them look like Rogue, and they're not like Rogue, and even if they are like Rogue, who knows what Rogue is?
And it also makes me kind of sad to remember how in the mid-90s you had a lot of genres being invented out of nowhere. Like the first RTS game was Dune.
Dune 2.
It was either between 93 or 95. It just happened. The first conventional survival horror game just happened. It started a genre out of nowhere.
It's like the years after Doom came out, every first-person shooter before it got that.
It was called a Doom clone
yeah.
until people gradually just called them FPS.
Exactly. And
so yeah, I do think there's too much focus on limitations being put on genres nowadays, which is one of the great ironies of the Kickstarter games, is that they're so very retrograde in a way. I mean, the publishing model is cutting edge, but the games that make the most from it aim for very old experiences, which is still fun for a player who has that frame of reference. But on the other hand, it's I guess not as flexible for creative, brave ideas that really, truly could not be greenlit through a traditional publisher.
Yeah, that was my question. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Thank you.
Hello again.
Hello.
Another question popped into my mind. Do you think that because games have become more mainstream throughout the years, that that's one of the reasons why games have started lending more and more from movies? Because board games are still very niche, but they keep being creative and using the mechanics that they can to get through with their aesthetics, and that the mainstream influence is something that has attracted the movie-like style of games.
I'm sorry, what was it again?
Do you think that the games becoming mainstream has attracted the movie-like style in games?
Oh, totally, because movies make lots of money. Why wouldn't marketers want to jump onto that? I think it's certainly been implemented to the detriment of a lot of formerly promising projects. The Order 1886 being one of the great disappointments of this year is kind of oftentimes ascribed to this